we just don't know enough about one another. So we're operating from our own positionality. And that's what really brought me into the realm of I have to work at the human realm before we move into this larger sustainability conversation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Alchemie Podcast. I'm your host, Dana Davis. The Alchemie Podcast explores a happier and healthier future for all. Featuring conversations with thought leaders, scientists, and change makers, we'll explore topics at the intersection of individual wellness, social equity, and sustainability. Join us as we look to bridge the gap between personal, community, and planetary well-being. Let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Alchemie Podcast. We have here today Anu Gupta to walk through with us breaking unconscious bias and enhancing belonging using mindfulness practices. Anu Gupta is an educator, lawyer, scientist, and bridge builder. He's committed to bolstering a global movement for social healing rooted in principles of mindfulness, compassion, and non-harming. An internal optimist, Anu believes that we are at our best when we honor ourselves as human beings rather than human doings. He's the founder and CEO of Be More with Anu, an ed tech benefit corporation that trains the nervous system of professionals in breaking bias. Anu came to this work after almost ending his life due to experiences with racism, Islamophobia, and homophobia. Thankful he didn't, though, and has since then dedicated his life to build a rigorous tech-enabled training methodology to advance bridge building and social healing across divides. I couldn't be more excited to have you here with us, Anu. Welcome, first and foremost.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, we're really excited to have you here. And I always like to start off on the podcast with just the speaker telling us about you in your own words. So if you could just give me a little bit of a quick TLDR about yourself and how your path led you to where you are today.
Yeah, I feel, first of all, it's so great to be here. And, I just want to greet everyone who's listening in the future. But, I feel that we're connected through these cosmic wavelengths together. And I think for me, as I reflect on this question of how I got on this path, I really feel like the path chose me because there's nothing really unique about my background and my education that would tell me that, hey, you're going to be an educator of DEI, particularly using mindfulness. And yet that is what my passion has become, particularly for the last 9 years. And I think for me, as I think about like the top three things that really led me here was first, I'm an immigrant to the US from India. So kind of living in this bicultural identity, I kind of knew what it's like to be an outsider and an insider and a bridge builder. And I've lived in many, many different places around the world, Malaysia, Myanmar, South Korea, UK, and kind of seeing how differences pop up in different places. But also I've had the felt experience, secondly, of what it's like to be both someone who is marginalized or subordinated in some way because of the way they look or any of their various identities. And I've also been in the place of being completely oblivious to the ways I've dominated or subordinated other people. So I think for me, those kind of complexity of ideas really came into this third thing, which is being super interested in mindfulness and compassion practices, particularly the neuroscience of that and how that helps build, new habits and change behavior, kind of brought me to this work of, hey, this is what bias is. What is unconscious? We can make unconscious through these tools of mindfulness. And for me, they were really kind of the silver bullet for us to really bridge both historical and current social divides, and to also help people really feel a sense of belonging in their own bodies and communities and families. We'll stop there. Immigration, felt sense experiences and, mindfulness.
So much there that I know we're going to get into as we dive into this conversation further. So I think that was a really great intro. But I think the first thing that actually brought us together, which is great, and I wanted to jump into it first and foremost, was that I had the pleasure of taking one of your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging trainings. And for those who are newer to the work, a lot of times it's shortened by DEIB. So if we use that language here today, that's what it stands for: diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And that's really how we were connected. I took one of your trainings and I just loved your methodology. I loved how you took your approach to it. And I've done so many of those and it was just really fantastic. So can you share a little bit more about Be More with Anu and your commitment to helping companies in their DEIB journeys?
Yeah. So, a lot of times if people look at me, they're like, hey, you're like a lawyer and a trained scientist. How did you end up becoming this person who's educating people around these concepts. Before any of my other professions, I was a middle school teacher.
Amazing.
And as a middle school teacher, I realized as an educator that when working with folks, whether it's young people or adults, the simple the concepts can be, the more they can reach people. So for me, as someone who's kind of really well read around the academia of, history or social scientists or neuroscientists, I feel like the big barrier is that a lot of the information that we've collected as a humanity is sitting in a lot of academic jargon. So for me, what was really important was to kind of simplify it so a high school student could understand it. So, and that's basically what our trainings are about. And they're really, really focused on advancing the conversation forward, acknowledging the pain, the hurt, the divisions that exist, but how do we heal them? So that's kind of, I think you've experienced a few courses of ours, Breaking Bias, DEIB, Wellness and Equity. And the way I really think about our humanity is that, we're all part of the same species, right? That's really our primary identity. We are all human beings, not human doings, right? As I like to say. And then through that, I feel we also have a lot of secondary identities. And these are the identities that we acquire in our very unique form that we've taken, things like our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our immigration status, our sexuality, our gender identity, our abilities. And for me, it's really important for us to remember what connects us, which is our primary identity at the absolute level, but also the way we're unique. These are our secondary identities. And I think this framework actually helped me. Firstly, when I came up with it, it was actually, I applied it to myself like 10 years ago. It was like, oh, the ways I felt different or separated from, let's say, white people or people of different colors or cultures or genders. It was like, actually, no, we're the same being. Like their nervous system operates very similarly to my own nervous system. And that kind of helped me really build this thing called empathy, right? It's a big buzzword, but that's basically what empathy is, being able to feel what other people are feeling. And that's kind of where the essence of my work kind of comes to where we are now.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And before we jump into mindfulness, something you talked about slightly was the secondary identity. And I think there's so much up there to unpack. And for me, in my experience in going through your trainings, that was really eye-opening to me and how you were able to simplify. There's all these other identities that make up maybe 1% of who we are when like 99% of us is really the same to the cellular level. And could you just break that down a little bit more and how you
Yeah.
think about intersectionality and our individual identities and how they overlap with one another
Yeah.
as we create a world of belonging?
Yeah, no, that sounds great. If we think about it, right, geneticists have shown that, and this is actually something really surprising for a lot of people, that all human beings across color and gender are 99.9% identical. And we aren't taught this, but this is because we're part of the same species, right? So we share like over 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, 60% with a banana, right? So we're part of creation. We're part of nature. We connect with one another. There's consciousness there. So it's really, that's the 99% that you're referring to. That's who we are as a being, as an animal. Then we take these forms, right? And for me, I think about these forms as how we're born, our biological identities, whether it's our anatomy, which again ends up making our sex, or, any disabilities that we are born with, whether they're genetic or physical, as well as a whole host of things, our hair color, eye color, our lips, depending on, our ancestors, our parents. But then there are also social identities and experiential identities, identities that our society assigns us based on culture. And then there's experiential identities, which is identities we acquire. Like for me, it's things like being a meditation teacher or a lawyer or an entrepreneur. These are things I've acquired. But it could also be things like being a trauma survivor because of what things that have happened to us, having a criminal record. All those things are things that kind of come to us. And this is where the game of DEIB really plays itself out. I call it a game because that's more playful. I mean, of course, it's not a game. But it is, on the one hand, that's what's kind of really determining our relative existence. And this is where I feel like the tools of mindfulness and compassion, what I call the PRISM tools, really support us in kind of moving the conversation forward.
That is a perfect segue because actually I want to jump now into PRISM tools and then, maybe a little bit about you too before we jump into that. I'm curious, can you share more about your wellness and spirituality journey and how it shaped your approach to your personal healing. And I think that's a really nice segue into then, some of
Yeah.
the things that you've worked and developed over
Yeah.
time.
Well, it's funny because I think they're completely connected. They're integrated. I feel like the Prism tools, which, for your listeners, I will just say that's kind of our secret sauce. Like, how do we really bridge these divides? It's by practicing these, what I call the Prism toolkit or toy kit, whatever you want to call it. And, this goes back to, well, how did I come to Prism? Well, as you shared in my kind of little intro about me, I've always been very optimistic. Like I've always looked at wanting to connect with people, really friendly. But having moved to the U.S. at a very early age, I was pretty brutally bullied for being perceived as gay, which I am. But initially, I was in the closet, so I couldn't really come out, for being an immigrant, for having an accent, for looking like a Muslim, whatever that means. And for me, I would just deny those parts of those experiences. And over time, that really took a toll on my mental and emotional health, to the point where I was severely depressed and kind of was in this phase of suicidal ideation. With that said, in college, I had begun practicing meditation, mindfulness in particular. And that was kind of a consistent practice. It wasn't consistent in the sense it wasn't a daily practice. It wasn't part of my routine, but I would particularly do it maybe once a week at minimum. So I think that really saved me. And after this experience that I had of attempting at my life and was unsuccessful, I really just returned to those tools. Of course, I got a therapist, I saw a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and got a lot of other helpers and healers, and kind of had my whole council to support me. But personally, I started really practicing some of the tools. And through the tools, I realized the power of visualization. I realized the power of loving kindness as a practice, loving kindness practice. I saw the power of curiosity, practicing curiosity when I'm with myself, with others. Some of the somatic tools I was learning through tools like somatic experiencing or tapping. So again, I was doing all of these things for my personal benefit while still kind of finishing law school, working as an attorney, as a researcher, kind of doing my external professional things, but kind of personally really on this path. And professionally, I was working in issues of racial equity and really interested in kind of finding solutions to these larger challenges our society continues to face. This was over 10 years ago. And I came across the research. There was an article that came out, I would say in 2011, 2012, that mindfulness helps reduce bias. The practice of scientists were actually showing that folks that practice mindfulness pre and post have significantly better relations across difference, are less likely to make decisions based off of stereotypes. And I was like, oh, there's something here. So I started kind of going down the rabbit hole. And then I discovered that for the past 20 years, now 30 years, scientists were actually testing a whole host of interventions to measurably reduce bias, known as prejudice reduction in the social science world. And as I looked at some of the interventions, I was like, oh, wow, this is amazing. But then how do we train folks en masse with these tools? Folks aren't just going to read a paper and be like, oh, now that I know that, mindfulness works, now that I know it, it's just going to become a part of me. No, you have to practice it to cultivate it as a skill. And that's how the PRISM toolkit really came about. So PRISM stands for perspective taking, pro-social behavior, individuation, stereotype replacement, and mindfulness. These are each individual tools, but they're all kind of rooted in mindfulness. Mindfulness being the ability to just recognize and notice what's happening in one's experience, moment to moment. Body sensations, emotions, feelings, ideas, thoughts, whatever's arising in this conscious being that we are across the board. And through that, we can build, to stereotype replacement, individuation, others. And these fancy scientific words, as it may seem, are actually the practices I was doing for my own healing. And I was like, wow, these things that I'm doing that have been known to humanity for possibly thousands of years now have a scientific basis, which is really important, in the world we're living in right now, where there's a lot of doubt and cynicism, and rightly so, because people have been duped by a lot of these tools in the past. But now that we can show brain scans showing a transformative shifts in people's kind of the gray matter that exists in people's brain and other things, it's like, oh, wow, we can really bring this to many more people. So that's kind of how I discovered, or the tools discovered me, and and this emerged out. And basically the Prism Toolkit is part of all of our training programs, because ultimately for us, when we're thinking about behavior change, when we're thinking about helping people be able to manage and regulate their emotions better, the practice of Prism tools really supports them in doing that.
Yeah. And that, I think, is exactly kind of the heartbeat of what we're kind of getting to, right? It's like the peak around unconscious bias. And I think, it's important for people to understand, the primary and the secondary, and then the tools that we have available to us to address those, and through mindfulness, et cetera. But can you speak to, for those who are maybe unfamiliar with what even unconscious bias really is, and
Yeah.
discuss how these practices can ultimately help create more awareness around our own unconscious bias and drive us then again toward that vision of a greater global community of belonging?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yeah, I want to start with a story actually. So this really came up for me when I was working as a young attorney, and I was in a courtroom once. I was actually a law student then, and we were working in New Orleans, trying to really address some of the disparities that existed in the criminal justice system, and working with a whole host of government actors, judges, prosecutors, security guard, prison guards, others. And I used to meet with a lot of these folks, and they were all like good people, whatever good means, but in our understanding of good, like, they were decent people, they gave to charity, they volunteered, they voted, like whatever, all the things you think. But then I noticed that, particularly I was working with one particular judge, that when he was in sentencing court, he was giving really harsh sentences for really petty crimes to the defendants that were there. And the defendants happened to be all young Black boys. And I was like, what's going on here? Because I'm in law school and folks are smoking and doing all sorts of really hard drugs that are controlled substances, but these poor Black, teenagers are going to prison for 2 to 4 years at a time for something that my folks are, my law school, classmates have no consequences for. And that's when I began to really understand. And again, the judge himself was a good person. He believed that he wasn't a racist, and I'm pretty sure he's not. But something that he thought or believed or felt was impacting the way he was seeing these young human beings. And that's basically what unconscious bias is. Unconscious bias, what I call it's learned habits of thoughts that distort how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So once I discovered that, I'm like, oh my gosh, of course there are consciously biased people out there, and conscious bias is basically false beliefs that people have. So like believing that, people of different races are genetically different. That's just a false belief. It's not based on fact or truth. People can believe it, but people can believe whatever they want, right? But It's not rooted in fact. So that's a conscious bias. But unconscious bias is when you're like, oh no, we're all one. And yet your behavior doesn't match those beliefs. So for me, it's like, oh, so to reach the unconscious, we need some training.
Mm-hmm.
We need to help folks make the unconscious conscious. And this is where the education piece, of our trainings and then the Prism tools really help. So the idea is really bridging understanding and compassion together to advance action.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so grounded too. I mean, you could look at mindfulness and you can also look at the DEIB world, and we need to deeply understand ourselves so that we can take aligned action in a direction we want to go as a global community. And so I think you've done such a beautiful job at weaving those two concepts together that often sit in silos. And that's really what we're all about here, is trying to pull apart these silos and bring them into one narrative so people understand that it's all interconnected at the end of the day. So one more question in this realm before we move on, though. What are some of the challenges? I know that you'd mentioned that the narrative and the science behind mindfulness and its support in DEIB has really transitioned over the past probably decade or so. But like, are there any specific challenges you've come across in educating and training around unconscious bias, and specifically thinking about the role of mindfulness into it, as I'm sure there's different perspectives on how mindfulness and what mindfulness is to different.
Yeah. No, I think it's such a great question. I think for me, there's like two big challenges. One is there's unconscious bias about unconscious bias. So, a lot of times folks have a preconceived notion of what a bias training ought to be or is supposed to be.
Mhm.
They're like, oh my God, I have to like brace myself. Like, I'm going to go for battle and like, it's going to be a really unpleasant experience. So they don't expect to laugh. They don't expect to be joyful. They don't expect to feel good, when they're doing our trainings. And even sharing that that's what's going to happen through our programs, like you, right? They're kind of in disbelief because nothing in their previous experience matches what we're offering, which is why it's really out of the box. And we just have to be patient there, right? We have to be like, that's okay, like really kind of work with folks. So that's one, right? And these are folks that are open to it already,
Mhm.
that want to do the work, and they're really excited by this idea of mindfulness being kind of the salve to move the conversation forward. With respect to like any preconceived notions around mindfulness, I think it's changing quite a bit. So I started Be More 9 years ago. So when we first started, there wasn't as much awareness of mindfulness as a concept. This is like pre Headspace, pre Calm, pre these like $1 billion unicorns that have, you
Working out of
know,
this space.
right,
Yeah.
exactly, that have made mindfulness more mainstream. But occasionally we do get some questions because, in people's minds, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic, people are more familiar with mindfulness, but they think of mindfulness, oh, this is something I do to address burnout. This is something I do for my well-being, very personal. And they're like, well, what does that have to do with like interpersonal relationships? And so for us, there's that opportunity to educate folks that, oh, like, it's actually both and because when you're well yourself, you're able to really listen better. You're able to communicate better. You're able to notice what's happening in your experience, whether you're being triggered or if there's discomfort, and then be able to manage your responses accordingly. So that's where kind of our education piece comes in. But so far, like we haven't had folks really resist it. But I do remember one of our earlier clients, which was like 7 or 8 years ago. We did a mindfulness. This was actually a huge healthcare system. I won't disclose which one. We went in for a training, and this person who was really like smart person, head of a department, they thought that we were trying to hypnotize them. This was literally a simple body scan.
Yeah.
My team and I were like, wow, you think we have a lot of power, like by like leading you through like a 5 minute,
Yeah.
literally body scan, like close your eyes and notice what's happening. And
Notice
you're
your
like,
fingers.
yeah, notice your fingers. If they were like, yeah, there's of course like a generational difference and a whole host of other
Mhm.
associations there. But yeah, no, we're not trying to practice hypnotism or any of those things, just helping people return to their own bodies
Yeah.
and their minds.
So, yeah, I know. I think it's so cool. Even in the past, 5 to 10 years, there's been an immense growth and awareness in this space.
Hmm. Hmm.
Something you said, which I love, it's like an not or it's a and, not this or that. So I love that perspective, and I think that ties so nicely to everything we're doing here. And my final question before we wrap things up here together is really around your perspective. I actually haven't had this conversation with you before around how these two things of individual wellness, community well-being connect then to this planetary system that we're in and the environment.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your perspective on that from the work that you're doing and how that can reverberate outward into just the global planet that we're on together.
Yeah. You know, I so I'm in New York City right now, and when we're recording this, it's Climate Week in New York City right now.
Mhm.
And there's so many protesters and activists and advocates from around the world here right now, really talking about issues of sustainability, issues of ending fossil fuels that are really important to just sustain life on our planet. And I've been really reflecting on, but what is the role of my work in there? And I really started on this work um, rooted in sustainability. Like I really care about the planet. I grew up in a tradition that's incredibly animist, that believes that we're interconnected to all beings everywhere, plants, animals, but also the elements, right? So there's all of these things are deeply sacred to me and to many people, many people around the world. And that's what I wanted to work on. But it was called the environmental justice movement over 10 years ago. And it was very separate from the environmental sustainability movement. It was very segregated.
Yes.
I realized that one of the challenges we were having in the movement was bias. And it wasn't conscious, right? A lot of it was like everybody had really good intentions and we're on the same page. We just didn't know. We just didn't have a shared understanding of our history, of who we are, what our aspirations are. And for me, that's really troubling because if we don't have a shared understanding, that basically means we don't share facts and we don't share the same reality. And when we don't share the same reality, we're operating from different places.
Yeah.
We have different intentions. And that's what I see happening in our world. We just don't know enough about one another. So we're operating from our own positionality. And that's what really brought me into the realm of, I have to work at the human realm before we move into this larger sustainability conversation. And for me, now going back to your question, that's really important because as individuals, we are part of various organizations and units, whether it's our family unit, our community units, whether it's a place of worship or a yoga studio or a meditation studio or a running club, as well as our workplaces, whether it's our own or others. So individuals make up these organizations. And these organizations, whether they're community or work-based, make up systems.
Yeah.
So this is where the work of consciousness shift within individuals is so important, because once we have a shared reality across our family units, our organizations, we can have systems change. Without that, we can't. And otherwise, we're just going to play what's been happening in our country, in our world for the last 50 years. Politics. Someone wins, they do what they want, then they lose, then someone else comes in and they do what they want.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is what we're seeing, like our elders, right, in the 60s and the 70s had all these victories around reproductive justice, environmental sustainability, civil rights that are now being repealed. And I talk to them and I'm with them. They're like, I can't believe this is happening. And then they share with me, we changed the policies. We failed to change hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Right. So that division has still passed through intergenerationally. So our work we have to really shift hearts and minds. And it doesn't matter what you believe in, what party you vote for. There are some things that ought to be shared across the party line, which is our humanity, our shared humanity. The fact that we share a planet with other species and we all have a right to dignity and life, right?
Yeah.
That we're not going to destroy our own house.
Yes.
So and that's where, the individual kind of meets the system level work.
That's such a good, starting to close down this conversation together. And I think the final thought around the climate conversation that I wanted to add is that there are a lot more conversations, which is so fantastic, around climate equity and climate action. They have to be one and the same. And we can't talk about action without equity anymore. And I think even in the past 5 years, I've seen such a dramatic shift in the sustainability world, which is great. Because more and more folks are seeing that interconnectivity, which is really what we want out of.
Yeah.
So to close things out here, I wanted to share one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I think it's also in your training. I remember seeing it within your training as well. But our goal is to build a beloved community. This will require a qualitative shift in our hearts and a quantitative shift in our lives. And so with that said, how can our community here at Alchemie better address these unconscious biases that we may each have in our day-to-day and ultimately create more belonging in the world for all beings everywhere?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Well, first of all, you've already done it because you've listened to this conversation. So I'm sure you've done it before this too, but it's really about planting our consciousness, our minds with these seeds of understanding and compassion. And, I don't like to give a lot of homework, but I would just say, if I can say two things one can do is really cultivate curiosity. And for me, curiosity is really about any like fixed opinions that we have about different types of people or species. Try to know more about them, read about them, follow, new accounts on your social media of folks you wouldn't otherwise follow. And the second is really keep optimism alive. It's really, really important as a skill. And connect it again back to social media because it plays such a huge role in our society. One thing we need to do in order to really address unconscious bias is stop the negativity. Really stop sharing negativity as well as stop consuming negativity. It's so transformative because in order for us to move forward, we can't just be in this mode of fight or flight. Our bodies need to be neutralized, and we really need to be able to imagine what's possible. So, yeah, those two quick tidbits, curiosity and optimism.
I love that. It's just easy for our listeners to take and apply to their life. Yeah. So thank you so much, Anu. This has been an amazing conversation, and I'm so grateful that you took some time out of your day to share your thoughts and your wisdom with us. I think, I was really looking forward to this conversation. So again, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Alchemie Podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation today, you can find more about the speaker in our show notes below. In order to build a global community committed to well-being for all, we need your help. So please rate and subscribe to wherever you're listening from. Finally, we could not do this without the help of our amazing team. A huge thank you and shout out to Lindsay Todd, our producer. All right, y'all, have a lovely, lovely day.